Today, the Delta variant wreaks havoc across Australia, putting another 200,000 Australians into lockdown. Also ahead, a rush for the shops as Darwin enters lockdown on 90 minutes notice.
We need to use the next few days to pause everything, to buy us more time.
3 days of restrictions for WA's Perth and Peel regions, including mandatory masks. The first full day of lockdown in Greater Sydney and surround sees 30 new local cases. And South Australia shuts its borders to Queensland, WA, the NT and the ACT in response to the growing threat. Hello and welcome to ABC News. I'm Miriam Corowa. Not since the national lockdown at the start of the pandemic have this many Australians across the country been living under strict coronavirus rules. The Delta variant of coronavirus has sent 2 cities into lockdown, with millions more living under restrictions once again. Sydney has recorded another 30 cases on its first full day of lockdown, while for the first time ever, the Northern Territory has detected cases of local transmission, putting Darwin under stay-at-home orders. Despite being urged to stay calm, we've seen panic buying at major shopping centres. Perth is also on alert. A physiotherapist has been infected and restrictions have been reinstated effective immediately. Queensland was due to ease restrictions further on Friday. They've wound back the changes in response to the growing threat. And Victoria, which is only just recovering from its latest outbreak, is back on high alert. Border restrictions are in effect and the Trans-Tasman travel bubble is on hold. The federal government is warning the public to expect more cases.
But can we manage it? Yes. Will we manage it? Yes. Will there be challenges over the coming days and over the course of the year? Because it's a global pandemic, there will be. But I think looking at these agonising case figures, just in the UK, one day, 18,000, around the world, 8,200 lives lost. What we do know is that Australia's systems are stronger than virtually any other jurisdiction and able to manage and able to resist and able to adapt and able to protect Australians.
Greg Hunt there. We have reporters across the country to take us through the evolving situation and restrictions. Let's start with the top end, where more than 200,000 people have gone into lockdown after the Territory recorded its first ever community cases. There are now 5 cases in total, all related to a worker at a major Central Australian gold mine. 2 of the new cases are on the mine site. 1 has since travelled to New South Wales and 1 has flown from the mine to Darwin. The 5th case and the newest case has been identified in Queensland. The lockdown encompasses Darwin, Litchfield and Palmerston. These are the toughest restrictions the region has faced in a year, and they will remain in place for at least 48 hours. There will be only 5 reasons for people to leave home. They include essential work, medical treatment, to receive or give care, to shop for essential goods or services, and for an hour of exercise. Affected residents won't be able to travel further than 5 kilometres from their home. The Chief Minister has defended the snap lockdown, saying he wants to get the situation under control as soon as possible.
We need to use the next few days to pause everything, to buy us more time while we continue to test, trace and trap this virus. Here in the Territory, we do not have the luxury of waiting and seeing. If we wait and it gets worse, it will be too hard to control. So we are taking extreme action right now to stop or slow any spread before the coronavirus is let loose in the Territory.
Reporter Isabel Masali is in Darwin to take us through the latest there. Isabel, what's the reaction been like where you are?
Well, the Northern Territory hasn't faced this type of situation before, and it was given just 90 minutes notice. So many people still aren't aware what's happening. Just a few minutes ago when I was wearing my mask, a man came up to me and asked if something's happened here because the mall behind me is pretty much completely empty. We went to Woolworths earlier today at a liquor store where there are huge queues of people panic buying, despite authorities saying do not do that because the stores will remain open during the lockdown. There we found a lot of locals who are really confused about the situation and many tourists who are really angered that they came up here for a holiday during the dry season and they're caught up in the lockdown. Here's what they had to say.
It's madness, absolute madness. Never seen it before. We're from Victoria, this thing doesn't happen. So, can't believe it. Unbelievable. We're right anyway, so all the best.
Pretty annoyed. Took us 8 years to get to Darwin and now we're going into lockdown. So, not happy. The kids have no idea what's going on. But yeah, the line's looking pretty long for the bottle-o.
It's easier to buy beer, alcohol, than it is to get food. I walked away from the food queue and came here.
This is a joke. What's going on now? I mean, how can COVID all of a sudden be there within the hour? Doesn't make any sense. I think the government's more scared than anybody. Yeah, waste of time, annoyance.
Are you shopping here today?
I was going to, but no more, not with this. It's just crazy.
From Sunshine Coast, but we don't know if we're allowed to leave or what's going on, so don't know what's going to happen. We're sort of in a bit of a pickle. We don't know whether to get food because we're meant to fly out tonight, but don't know what's going on.
My nieces have just flown up on holiday from Perth, so straight into lockdown. It's a bit of a shock. But yeah, it's one of the things you have to deal with during this point in time. There's no control over it. You try to do the right things with everybody and hope it works out, but unfortunately it doesn't always work that way.
So Isabel, as you say, with just an hour and a half warning given, how well prepared is the community?
Well, to just put it into context, the Northern Territory hasn't dealt with a lockdown since the very early days of the pandemic, and that was just following along with what the rest of the country was dealing with. But people in the lines for the supermarket today were stopping me and asking me if I had extra masks because they didn't have any. So that sort of gives you an idea of how prepared people are. We tried to contact some health groups to ask them how they feel about the situation, and they were too tied up having their own meetings this afternoon to try and figure out what is going on and how to respond to it. So it's something that came about really abruptly, and people are slowly coming to terms with what they'll be dealing with in the next 48 hours.
Our reporter Isabel Musali there with all the details in Darwin. There are 30 new locally acquired cases of COVID-19 in New South Wales, including a Virgin Australia flight attendant. That case is causing serious concern as the worker was on 5 different flights while potentially infectious. 11 of today's cases have been in isolation for their infectious period, and another 3 cases were in partial isolation. The New South Wales Premier has defended her decision to send 2 million people into lockdown.
I don't regret a single decision we've taken because all of it's been based on the health advice. But also, when you're making a major decision to lock down millions and millions of people, you have to make sure it's based on the health advice and not because you want to turn up with 0 cases every day. We based all of our advice on balancing the health advice that we were given with making sure our citizens were given that information. And so these decisions are big decisions. It's not a decision you take lightly when you lock down literally millions and millions of people, but that's based on the health advice.
With more on the situation in New South Wales, political reporter Ashley Raper joins us now. Ashley, just take us through the specifics of the new cases that were announced today.
Miriam, the good news is of the 30 new cases, all have been linked to the Bondi cluster. But it isn't just about these days with the Delta strain linking these cases. The concern is that 19 of these 30 cases, 19 of these people were out and about in the community while they were infectious. So that obviously increases the list of exposure sites and therefore the number of people who have been potentially exposed and then infected with this virus. And now, of the 30 as well, 10 are linked to a wholesale food place in Marrickville, Great Ocean Foods. Now, there are 10 cases there, and one of those cases is the crew member that flew on the Virgin Australia flight, and they flew from over the past Friday and Saturday, so the past 2 days. They had flights while they were working from Sydney to Brisbane, Brisbane to Melbourne, then Melbourne to Sydney, then back up from Sydney to Gold Coast and back again. And anybody who was on those flights with the crew member have been deemed as close contact. So there are a number of people who will be further in isolation within this lockdown as the number of cases around these 30 new cases today grow.
Ashley, what has the government had to say today about its response with bringing this lockdown into force?
Now, this is a lockdown that's unlike the Northern Territory lockdown that you were just talking about. This isn't to buy time. This is a lockdown for 2 weeks to really stop chains of transmissions. And the government is saying that they were left with no choice but to bring this lockdown into effect because there were just so many cases now, so many sites, and the potential for this to keep spreading because this is the Delta strain and it is so contagious. Now, there have been a number of questions asked of the Premier why this lockdown was not brought in sooner. Now, Wednesday last week was when it became apparent that the government was extremely concerned about it when they put in harsher restrictions. Then on Friday, they put in the lockdown on certain areas in Greater Sydney, and now yesterday it was when the full lockdown came into effect. Now, Gladys Berejiklian says every decision she has made, that she made based on health advice. The health advice was evolving and that she responded. And she says it has nothing to do with the fact that in the past her government has really made a point and made it a point of pride that they don't lock down. She said that did not factor in her decision. She's made the decision to lock down based on working with our Chief Medical Officer, Dr. Kerry Chant, and now this lockdown is in place for at least 2 weeks, Miriam.
Reporter Ashley Raper there with the latest in Sydney. Now let's find out what's been happening in regional New South Wales. Reporter Brianna Holden joins us from Jindabyne in the Snowy Mountains. Now, Brianna, what's the feeling been like there in Jindabyne since the announcement of the Sydney lockdown?
Yeah, everyone in Jindabyne has been reasonably positive. Today, business hasn't been overly busy. Car parks haven't been quite as full, but a lot of people have the feeling that Sydney-siders are doing the right thing. If they're here already, they're heading home, and if they had bookings, they're cancelling those bookings. So on a community safety front, everyone is feeling reasonably confident. We spoke earlier to the Mayor of the Snowy Monaro Shire. He said that everyone he's spoken to is feeling quite confident. We also spoke to the Chamber of Commerce President, Olivia Kaptanakos, who had similar sentiments.
And as we know, the shutdowns from the other states and now the information that's coming through from Sydney, the greater part of Sydney, is now affecting us as a lot of them are now heading back home to isolate.
But there's also a level of fear from those people coming from Victoria or from Queensland. If they do come here, are they going to be stuck here? Mind you, if you're going to be stuck in the Snowy Mountains.
Brianna, you mentioned that it's not quite as busy as we might have hoped, particularly in a school holiday period. Are there concerns for business revenue over the winter season?
Yeah, that is the big concern about town. A lot of people from Sydney, we've heard 80% of tourists to this region are from Sydney, and they come during the school holidays when it's obviously ski season. The town has worked quite hard to make sure it's not just a winter revenue rather, but they also build on the summer revenue. But a lot of people are quite concerned. We spoke to a business owner just not that long ago who said this morning he had 16 people in his eco cabins. This afternoon he has none. He's had bookings all the way through this period. It was going to be his busiest winter period yet, but he has so far not had a single backfill booking up until at least the 15th of this coming month. So he's very concerned that during this period of time, business isn't going to pick up. There aren't going to be people from other regions coming in like they'd hoped. So that is a real concern. But we've also heard sentiments that, this COVID lockdown earlier in the year has forced a lot of people to travel regionally, and they have had a higher summer proportion of visitors than usual. So it's not going to affect livelihoods as much as it could have, but there are serious concerns that there isn't going to be bookings for a large portion of winter, given how many Sydney-siders actually visit the Snowy Monaro region.
That will be tough indeed. Now, of course, while those restrictions are in place, most people are observing them, but the odd one or two may be breaching rules. Has there been any indication that there are Sydney-siders in Jindabyne at the moment, or just people generally disobeying restrictions? Because, of course, we do have some restrictions affecting regional areas of New South Wales.
Yeah, well, out here in regional New South Wales, you need to be having masks on in indoor places, social distancing. A lot of the rules that we've come to acknowledge are general restrictions during COVID outbreaks. From what we've seen, most people are observing those rules. We spoke to someone at a bakery this morning who said that visitors were a little confused when they woke up about why they were having to sign in, popping their masks on. But in general, everyone has responded quite positively. We've also heard that the police immediately after the announcement yesterday from 6 p.m. onwards were checking restaurants to make sure that they were COVID compliant. We've also heard some reports that up on the mountain itself that people are having their postcodes checked, and national parks are checking as well, just to make sure everyone is compliant. So far we haven't come across anyone from Sydney who is breaking the rules, but we have heard that there is a little bit of confusion as to if you've been here for a week or more, if you have to head home. So there's a few people seeking clarity, but in general what we've heard is that everyone is pretty content with how Sydney-siders have reacted, and that while business has been impacted, that the actual area itself won't suffer a COVID outbreak. So it's a bit of an optimism angle on it, but a lot of people are hoping that this will be a short-term restrictions for regional New South Wales.
Let's hope indeed. Our reporter Brianna Holden there at Jindabyne in the Snowy Mountains. Now, the ACT has moved to make face masks mandatory in response to the situation unfolding in New South Wales. From midnight tonight, people will be required to wear masks while indoors with people they don't usually live or work with. That includes while in supermarkets and shops, on board public transport, and for hospitality workers. There are no active coronavirus cases in the ACT. The Capital Territory is also requiring residents returning from the Northern Territory to stay at home, aligning with the lockdown that's in place there. To WA now, where new restrictions have been announced today after a Perth woman tested positive on return from New South Wales. The woman, aged in her 50s, travelled to Sydney on the 15th of June and spent time in Bondi before returning to Perth on the 20th of June. Authorities are operating under the assumption that she has the Delta variant of coronavirus. Those new restrictions are in place immediately for the Perth and Peel regions. They will remain in place for at least 3 days and also apply to people who have left those regions. Here are the new rules. Masks are mandatory indoors and on public transport. A 30-person limit is in place for private gatherings. The 2 square metre rule is being instated for hospitality venues, gyms and places of worship, while weddings and funerals will be limited to a maximum of 150 people. Today's AFL match between West Coast and the Western Bulldogs will be played in front of an empty Perth stadium. The WA Health Minister says they've got to act fast.
We are treating this situation very seriously. We are working on the assumption we are dealing with the very contagious Delta variant. As a result, and until public health can confirm if the virus has spread, restrictions will come into effect immediately for the Perth-Peel region for a minimum period of 3 days.
Reporter Herlin Kaur has more and joins us from Perth. Herlin, take us through the details of what's known about this new case of coronavirus in Perth.
So we know that this is a Perth woman aged in her 50s. She travelled to New South Wales and over there she visited a known hotspot over in Sydney. Now back in Perth, she visited a number of public venues. That includes 2 schools, an IKEA store, several supermarkets and a brewery, all in Perth's northern suburbs. And so we know that she's been infectious from the 22nd to the 24th of June. And this case is obviously being treated, as you said, as a Delta variant of the COVID-19 virus. So health authorities are urgently, asking people who have visited those exposure sites, which are available online to access, to get tested immediately, so that they can obviously find out how much this has actually spread into the community.
Now, Herlin, with all those new exposure sites listed, restrictions, of course, have been brought in for 3 days. Just take us through all the ins and outs there.
Yes, so there'll be 3 days of restrictions that came into effect from noon today. So masks will be mandatory now for indoor venues and public transport as well. Restrictions at venues will be in place as well. 150 capacity limit for events and businesses and venues. Those that cannot adhere to 150 people capacity will have to obviously be cancelled or shut down. So that will all be in place for at least 3 days. Now today, even before the government actually came out to front the media with this new announcement, we know people at Perth Stadium were actually being turned away. And so that footy game between the West Coast Eagles and the Western Bulldogs did go ahead. There's just been no crowds. So there was a lot of disappointment there. We spoke to a lot of people outside the stadium. Many were, had travelled from far and wide just to watch this game. So this is what we heard a little bit from them outside there.
A bit disappointed, but we've got to do what we've got to do. And go
I'd rather
home.
be safe than dead, mate.
Oh, pretty frustrated covering all those kilometres. Yeah, it's pretty frustrating. Have it banned 3 hours before the game, but it is what it is, I guess, unfortunately.
We're doing the best out of all the states so far, and yeah, if we keep up what we're doing, we'll keep safe.
It's just disappointing, but you've got to keep the country safe, so as long as we're all safe, doesn't last long. We'll be back here next weekend.
Sucks, but if it's the right thing to do, I don't know. It's just is what it is, isn't it? COVID times.
So as mentioned, anyone who's visited any of those exposure sites in Perth are being urged to immediately get tested and quarantine until they get a negative result. For now, these restrictions will be in place for at least 3 days, but the WA government has said that it will not hesitate to, impose a lockdown if necessary.
Our reporter Herlin Kaur there, keeping us up to date in Perth. The South Australian Government has closed its borders to Queensland, Western Australia, the Northern Territory and the ACT. New South Wales residents remain banned. Only returning South Australians and other essential travellers will be allowed in, but they'll be subject to restrictions which are still to be finalised.
This is what will be able to keep our state safe and our economy strong into the future. Can I also announce that we do need to look at the level of restrictions that we have internally in South Australia. It is quite possible that there has been some seeding of the Delta variant from New South Wales or from Victoria into South Australia, and so with the very low level of restrictions that we have in South Australia, we need to look at those. We'll be looking at those over the next 24 hours. There'll be a further announcement tomorrow. We are thinking of moving for a higher level of restrictions internally in South Australia for a 1 week period. This would address things like the numbers at home gatherings, the density arrangements, the mask wearing, particularly in aged care and also in other settings where there may be vulnerable sites. So it is a worrying situation that is developing right around Australia at the moment. We only get a single chance to act decisively and quickly with regards to that. That's precisely what we'll be doing here in South Australia.
The federal opposition says the lockdown declared for Sydney and surrounding regions is a direct result of the Prime Minister's failures to get the nation vaccinated quickly. Anthony Albanese says a better rollout of jabs and dedicated quarantine facilities could have made all the difference. For more, we're joined now by political reporter James Glenday from Parliament House. James, does Mr Albanese, though, support the Sydney lockdown?
Yeah, he does, Miriam, and he also supports the actions that have been taken by other states and territories. He says that he doesn't want to politicise this issue in terms of how the states are acting. He says for the most part they seem to be acting on the health advice that they've been given. However, he has much, much stronger words for the federal government, in particular the Prime Minister, Scott Morrison. He says that if the government hadn't been so focused on announcing vaccines and patting itself on the back, then he believes that this could have all all been avoided. In a press conference this morning, he also said that it was unacceptable that so few aged care workers have been vaccinated and that so few Australians, around 4%, he said, had been fully vaccinated. Here's some of what he had to say.
The Morrison government have had two jobs this year, effective national quarantine and the rollout of the vaccine, and they've failed both. And this lockdown is a direct result of that.
Anthony Albanese there. Now, James, have we heard from the Prime Minister today?
No, we heard a little video from him yesterday. He's still, of course, in quarantine at the Lodge after coming back from the G7 summit in Cornwall in the United Kingdom. It was left to his Health Minister, Greg Hunt, to face the media. He actually answered a whole lot of questions on vaccines, rollout timetables, the support that's being provided to the states, and some of the criticism about the delays to the vaccine rollout, things that we've heard before. Interestingly, he also gave some fresh figures about how many people have been vaccinated, and he really stressed the number of people who have had their first dose of a vaccine. Here's some of Greg Hunt earlier today.
Today, I want to acknowledge that we've now passed 7,326,000 vaccinations. That includes 28.5% of eligible Australians who've had first doses, over 50.8% of over 50-year-olds, 59.5% of over 60-year-olds and 68%, well over two-thirds, of 70 and above.
That was Greg Hunt there. Now, James, in a very busy day when it comes to coronavirus, we've also had other movements happening politically. The new Nationals leader, Barnaby Joyce, has reshuffled his front bench.
Yeah, on another day, Miriam, this might be one of the biggest stories in the country. But no, New Look front bench demoted because of all the drama happening right around the country. But it is worth noting some of the changes that Barnaby Joyce has put in place. Effectively, he has rewarded those who returned him to the Deputy Prime Ministership and punished those who had opposed him for a long time. The biggest and probably highest profile loser on this is Darren Chester. He was the Veterans Affairs Minister. He has now been dumped entirely from the ministry, including obviously Cabinet. Keith Pitt has been demoted from Cabinet to the Outer Ministry. However, he is going to keep his portfolios, which of course has the big portfolio of resources. And I think probably the biggest two winners are Bridget McKenzie, who of course left Cabinet amid the sports rorts saga. She will return. And Andrew Gee, who has held a few small roles, is now jumped straight into Cabinet. There are a couple of other changes. David Gillespie becomes the Regional Health Minister. Mark Coulton has been entirely dumped from Cabinet, but those are all in the Outer Ministry. And obviously Michael McCormack, the former Deputy Prime Minister, will be sitting on the backbench too. Barnaby Joyce, I asked him about this a short time ago, why he decided to dump Darren Chester, who's widely regarded as a pretty competent minister. And he said, well, look, it's politics and there's only a set number of positions, and I hope that he will continue to contribute on the backbench. And I do know, Miriam, that will frustrate Mr Chester to no end, because he had hoped that in this reshuffle, Barnaby Joyce, who keeps saying that he's a changed person, might try for unity and for healing, and as a sign of that, keep Mr Chester on. But it wasn't to be.
All right, well, with all the latest there from Parliament House, political reporter James Glenday. Angela Webster is a Professor of Clinical Epidemiology at the University of Sydney, and she joins us now for some further insight and analysis of the unfolding COVID situation that we're now seeing across many parts of the country. Just to begin with, Professor Webster, let's have a look at Sydney and the region around Sydney, because that's where we've seen the biggest cluster emerging, and 30 new cases today. What is your sense of how authorities are managing this current outbreak, the effectiveness of the lockdown that's been introduced, and what you might anticipate with numbers in the coming days?
Well, I think it's been a very quickly evolving situation, and of the new cases, the important number is the number that have been out in the community spreading infection without realising it, and that's 19 of the 30 we've seen today. So the contact tracers have been hard at work. We know that they're all linked back to clusters, but what they're working through now is trying to work out where all those people have been and who else they may have spread the infection to. We do expect that with the Delta variant, more household members are becoming infected compared with the Alpha variant we had last year. So the case numbers will go up for the immediate people around those cases, but also also potentially they've spread it in the community, and that's what's the real worry.
Well,
now,
please.
So as I said, the health service directive that we had last week on Friday was difficult. I think health messaging needs to be easy to understand and easy to implement. And when we had the lockdown of just certain LGAs in central Sydney, that was quite hard for people to work out. Whereas the directive that came last night, although it's harsh and no one wants it, we know that it's easy to understand. Everyone knows now what they need to do. They all need to stay home. And I think that's going to be easier for people to implement because they know exactly what to expect from everyone else as well.
And extended to 2 weeks now as well. How critical is that?
I think that's the start. I think if we look at the way that outbreaks have played out in the past, and that was with a less transmissible variant, then we've seen that often 3, 4, 5 weeks is about the play of how things play out. So I think this early date of the 9th of July may be the first tier. I'd hope that by then we may be able to relax things slightly, but we won't be going straight back to normal. And I think that's going to become increasingly apparent as we see how the cases have spread in the community in the following days.
Well, of course, among cases that were recorded today for New South Wales, one involves a Virgin Airlines crew member and 5 flights that particular crew member worked on while potentially infectious. We're also now starting to see cases being recorded for the first time in the Northern Territory, and in Western Australia we've had someone who visited New South Wales, went home, tested negative initially, but has now subsequently tested positive. So it just goes to show how variable circumstances can be. Just taking us back to the Virgin Airlines crew member, what do you make of that particular scenario with 5 flights across a number of different cities where people are now close contacts?
Well, clearly the person didn't know they were infectious when they were doing that, and they must be feeling terrible about it. And where they've picked it up seems to have been from related to the Bondi cluster in Sydney, but perhaps at one of the inner west locations. And I think in some ways, we know that airports have had quite high hygiene and coronavirus measures in place for a long time and on the planes. So we could hope that there's been no transmission during those flights, but we don't know. A lot of the other cases that have seeded into other states and territories have not been from such controlled environments. They've been, we've got the mine in the Northern Territory, and people who've simply been on holiday. Not testing positive until they get home. So we're hoping that because of the strict measures that have been in place around travel and airports and aircrew, that won't have spread further.
Now, taking us to the Northern Territory, where a snap lockdown has been introduced for 48 hours, it was that situation involving the gold mine, where there were hundreds of contacts that were identified there. The authorities in the Northern Territory are concerned about uncontactable contacts, some 14 or 15 people. What sort of concerns does that raise, do you think, if people potentially have been, moving about in the community and not observing restrictions and requirements?
Well, I think it's a nice illustration of the fact that in Australia, people are moving around a lot more than they were a year ago when we had the first wave of coronavirus here. We were trying to reach elimination, whereas now people are moving around, and that's what happened to seed into the other states too. The mine is a very specific case with FIFO operators who are used to flying in and flying out all the time, and when they're off, they're off. And it may be that they're uncontactable because they are off in the outback somewhere, having their respite before they go back to work. So it's a very tricky situation, and it will call, record keeping and the things that we can learn from some of these events to stop them happening again will be crucial. And how miners are contacted when they're not actually at work is going to become under the microscope, I think.
Professor Angela Webster, Professor of Clinical Epidemiology at the University of Sydney. We do appreciate your insights and your analysis for us here on ABC News. Thank you so much for joining us.
Anytime, thank you.
You can keep up to date at news.abc.net.au and on ABC iView. Here are the top stories on ABC News. Another 200,000 Australians have gone into lockdown due to concerns over the Delta coronavirus variant. The Northern Territory has recorded 5 local cases today, the region's first since the pandemic began. All positive cases are linked to the worker in the Central Australian gold mine. Sydney has recorded 30 new local cases today on the first full day of lockdown. A Perth woman who visited Bondi on holiday has tested positive after returning to WA. In response, new restrictions have been imposed on the Perth and Peel regions for the next 3 days. South Australia is immediately closing its borders to Queensland, WA, the Northern Territory and the ACT. Only returning South Australians and other essential travellers will be allowed in. And the Deputy Prime Minister Barnaby Joyce has reshuffled his party's front bench, promoting his supporters and booting his detractors from Cabinet. Bridget McKenzie has returned, and Michael McCormack will remain on the backbench after losing his job as Nationals leader. Let's now bring in our COVID data analyst, Casey Briggs, for a look at the numbers around the country. Casey, all of a sudden we are talking about a lot of states and territories with COVID cases.
Yes, Miriam, what a remarkable deterioration in the situation with coronavirus in this country. All of a sudden, 5 states and territories around the country have some form of local exposure to coronavirus in their current immediate past, in the last day or so, or in the last few days at the very least. So I think what we ought to do is just probably step through each of those situations, do a bit of a call of the board of what's going on. First, the ACT, no cases there, but even with no cases, the ACT has today decided to institute compulsory face mask rules for indoor spaces across the territory, they're saying in response to the situation in New South Wales. We also have no cases in South Australia. They're thinking about elevating the restrictions in place there, as well as closing the border to 5 states and territories across the country. They're looking at, as a preemptive safeguard against potential seating events, lifting restriction levels, things like masks in the community there. So we're looking at these, preemptive strikes against what we have is 30 local cases in New South Wales. Might come back to that one because there's a bit more to talk about there. 4 cases in the Northern Territory, all of them local. Let's bring up the Northern Territory because they have only had all coronavirus cases in the NT since the beginning of the pandemic, 182 of them. And all of these have virtually all been overseas acquired. A few of them have been interstate acquired, but they've virtually all happened in hotel quarantine until today. We've finally, after a very long time, seen the first local transmission of cases in the Northern Territory linked to this Tanami gold mine cluster. One case that's picked up the virus in Queensland hotel quarantine in Brisbane, has brought it to the mine, has infected now 4 others at least. And the risk there is that the close contacts of that person, because it's a mine, a FIFO mine, they have sprayed out across the country. Hundreds of them are in WA, hundreds of them in other states. So potentially lots of seeding could have happened there and some exposure in Darwin. So a 2-day lockdown in the Northern Territory. We've got in Queensland 2 local cases and a third overseas acquired case linked to this Portuguese flight crew cluster. We think the formal epidemiological link has not been found there yet, but it sounds like that's the most likely scenario here, that they will eventually be linked to that cluster just because of the social networks that have been observed. And here's the locally acquired cases in Queensland through the pandemic. You can see that since May last year, you can see just how few there are, how rare this is. And so we've seen an elevation in restrictions in Queensland again today as they deal with both this cluster and potential risks from seeding from New South Wales. Where else? We've got Tasmania with no cases yet today. Victoria has 3 overseas acquired, so no locally acquired cases. Let me bring up that though, because we are at the tail end of another outbreak there. Fingers crossed, all of these most recent cases have been people in isolation, in quarantine through their infectious period. So this one is on the way to being extinguished, but it is still a state that's dealing with active coronavirus cases, hopefully not for too much longer. And then we've got Western Australia as the final one. One case, a case that has returned from Sydney, been to one of those exposure sites in Bondi, has brought the virus back without realising it. Hasn't done anything wrong because it was only named as an exposure site after they were back in WA and in the community, but it means we have local exposure to coronavirus in WA. And again, here are the local cases in WA since May last year. Not very many of them, and the WA government's very keen to keep this one at 1 if they can. So that's why we've seen an increase in restrictions again in WA. So quite a lot changing today. 5 states now with active cases of coronavirus that are locally acquired. A lot has happened.
So Casey, take us back to New South Wales, the biggest outbreak in Sydney. What's the latest on the Bondi cluster?
Yep, so this remains the biggest outbreak in the country at the moment, 30 cases today. So that's one more than we had yesterday when we had 29. That brings the total size of this outbreak to 112 cases. And there's a lot of good news about this as well, despite the fact that Sydney's in a 2-week lockdown. Good news being that's 30, it's a big number, but they're all linked back to the Bondi cluster. We're not seeing lots and lots of mystery cases and new chains of transmission popping up. What's not so good is that not all of these, in fact, a fair few of these were not in isolation. They have been out in the community, potentially creating new exposure sites and infecting people. We want to see the numbers of, even if the numbers are like 30 in the coming days, we want to see a higher proportion of them being close contacts that had already been found, tracked down and put into isolation. So that's one of the kind of key things that we'll be watching for in the coming days. But still, 30 cases, let's just compare that quickly to the size of other outbreaks we've seen in New South Wales, the Crossroads outbreak and the Avalon outbreak. It is getting bigger. It's still not, vastly out of step with the ones that we've seen in the past, but it is getting bigger faster than those were at this point. Of course, that one, Crossroads, came under control without any lockdown at all. We are in a lockdown there, so you'd hope that the Bondi cluster will come under control quite a bit quicker. That's the plan of the government, get this under control, get this back to zero spread as quickly as possible. And one thing that's helping is the testing rates in New South Wales. We're seeing really big numbers at the moment, more than 50,000 test results coming in a day. There was a big spike about the time of the Avalon cluster in December. We're now seeing spikes that are almost getting to that level, and if it's sustained for a few days, you probably will see more tests being done at this point than were at that time. But 52,000 yesterday, 55,000 the day before. That's a really good sign that people in Sydney are taking this seriously.
Our COVID data analyst, Casey Briggs there, taking us through the numbers. Margie Osmond is the Chief Executive of the Tourism and Transport Forum. She joins us now from Sydney. Margie Osmond, thank you for taking the time to speak to us. A lot of developments happening today right around the country. These can't be good news for businesses in the tourism sector, particularly given the 18 months leading into this. What's your assessment of what this is likely to mean?
Look, I think this is going to be devastating for large sectors of the industry, and in fact it could very well be the moment for many of them that they send the white flag up that flagpole and say, too hard, we can't continue. I think we're going to see some fairly significant drop in tourism consumption figures for this school holiday period, simply because of the lockdowns in New South Wales, which of course is the biggest driver nationally from a tourism perspective, and add to that the fact now that people in New South Wales won't be able to do the sorts of day trips and other things that might otherwise still have been possible.
Is it possible to draw on what happened earlier in the pandemic when we had lockdowns in place to get a sense of just how significant? Can we quantify at this stage what the expectation is? And you point out there as well that, a number of businesses have been struggling already leading into this. So is it possible to give an idea of what sort of losses we're looking at?
Look, I think the important thing to think of here is that at a moment when the rest of the economy had in fact been picking up and unemployment figures were very low, the tourism industry was continuing to struggle quite desperately simply because of the uncertainty around borders. And that doesn't matter where you are in the country or where you might have been planning on going. If there is border uncertainty, it tends to encourage people simply not to travel at all. And in fact, that border uncertainty is more dangerous or considered to be more of a problem by travellers than the virus itself. So we're going to be looking at many hundreds of millions of dollars lost in the next couple of weeks around the country. There's no getting away from that. But I think the real problem is going to be this is a very substantial slice of the annual revenue for the industry. And if it's going to disappear, as we likely think will be the case now for much of the country, particularly New South Wales, there will be businesses that don't survive. And I think we'll be looking at thousands of business failures around the country off the back of this.
So what's your assessment of the kinds of support that are provided for businesses in the tourism sector at this point?
Look, I think state governments have been doing very inventive work with a whole range of encouragement and enticement packages to get people to go out and do things and eat and travel and goodness knows what else. But in the end run, given the fact that so long as we have no border certainty, both international or domestic, and no vaccination process that the industry can rely upon that might make the border issue less of an issue. If we're going to have a tourism industry in 12 months' time, I think the government at both state and federal level is going to have to reconsider what kind of wages support they can put into this industry. I know that there's a great reluctance to continue anything that looks like the earlier subsidisation projects that governments ran, but I do think that if we're going to have any kind of tourism industry left, particularly those parts of the industry that are internationally exposed, are going to need additional support, cash support.
So something perhaps more like a selective JobKeeper program for, identified areas and regions might be what you're suggesting would be most effective?
Some version of that kind of wage support like JobKeeper. I mean, it's not a popular conversation to have with government, but essentially there are reasons why countries like Singapore chose to extend it well beyond the point where it was brought to a close here in Australia. I think there's also a real need, though, rather than just pointing the finger at something like JobKeeper. This is a conversation that the National Cabinet now needs to have. This is an industry that is uniquely affected in a way no other industry is. And we really need some kind of unified approach, not only to the border issue, but also to what support looks like and a willingness of federal government to work with certain state governments.
Is there a sense as well that people aren't necessarily perhaps understanding the impact that, the devastation on tourism will have more broadly for the economy if this continues?
And I think that's an awfully good point, because essentially it's all those industries that support the tourism industry too, agricultural producers, people who design and make furniture. There's a million different parts of the process, and the arts community, of course, which is a very big part of the tapestry of making us an interesting tourism destination. The other thing to keep in mind is that we've already had a tremendous bleed of skilled people out of our industry into other industries, and that's created a serious structural imbalance in terms of the industry being able to just operate. This is definitely not going to help. And, we're in a situation at the moment where previously, even if people wanted to come and stay in a hotel in a big city and have a lovely weekend away, hotels are having to cap the number of bookings because they can't get enough staff to actually look after the people who previously were travelling. So essentially, this lockdown activity and the ongoing impacts to our industry makes us very unattractive to lots of people, to work in our industry. So that in itself is a really monstrous problem for us.
It is a very critical time. We do thank you, Margie Osmond, the Chief Executive of the Tourism and Transport Forum, for speaking to us on ABC News. Thank you.
Thank you.
Australia has recorded dozens of community cases across the country today, with the federal government announcing all of Greater Sydney is now a Commonwealth hotspot. Federal Health Minister Greg Hunt announced roving clinics, asymptomatic testing and further support for aged care workers in New South Wales has been expanded. Mr Hunt says extra support will also be offered to remote Indigenous communities in the Northern Territory.
With regards to New South Wales, the Chief Medical Officer has widened the declaration of the Commonwealth hotspot to cover the same area as the New South Wales Government, and extended that to the 9th of July. That also brings with it asymptomatic testing for all New South Wales GP-led respiratory clinics, or the Commonwealth clinics with which Australians have become very familiar. Support for aged care workers in COVID-19 has been expanded significantly, and that includes the single-site worker arrangements, the provision of PPE. In addition, we have a Commonwealth officer embedded with New South Wales Health in the Aged Care State Health Emergency Operations Centre. General JJ Fruin has authorised activation of expanded roving clinics for in-reach vaccination, and there are 410 residential aged care facilities across Sydney. All of these, 100% of these, have had first dose vaccinations, and 409 of the 410 have had second dose vaccinations, with the remaining ones scheduled in the coming days. With regards to the NT, I've been in touch with the NT Health Minister, and have also briefed the Prime Minister. They have implemented immediately with strong actions early to ensure that their territory and their Indigenous as well as non-Indigenous communities are protected. We think that this is appropriate, the actions that they've taken, and timely. We've ensured that the current stock of point-of-care testing is focused in the NT, more than 4,000 cartridges for testing all of those who may be needed and in remote or otherwise difficult to reach communities.
The opposition says the Morrison government's failure to provide an effective vaccine rollout has led to Sydney's current outbreak of the Delta variant of COVID-19. Labor leader Anthony Albanese says with only 4% of the population vaccinated, the government is losing track of its main task. He says the Nationals' leadership challenge last week is a sign the government has lost focus.
When it comes to the rollout of the vaccine, we're on just 4% of Australians being fully vaccinated. That's in spite of the fact that Scott Morrison said we're at the front of the queue and we're way, way back in that queue. This is a government that's been too busy focused on congratulating itself and too busy on not doing its main task, which is the rollout of the vaccine and fixing national quarantine. Instead, we saw this week in Parliament a government focused on itself, a government that replaced a Deputy Prime Minister, and no one can say what that Deputy Prime Minister did wrong to deserve being replaced by a failed former Deputy Prime Minister. Yesterday in the Northern Territory, at the same time as they were dealing with an outbreak, the CLP's priority was knocking off a sitting senator from their ticket. This is a government that's defined by politics, defined by looking after itself, defined by spin rather than substance, and we saw that with the Prime Minister's ongoing seeking to divide the states. His ongoing appraising of New South Wales, but criticising other states for doing exactly the same thing. Labor believes that the nation needs to be united and not seek to divide states. Governments need to respond to health advice, as the Berejiklian government has done yesterday. So we think also the fact that this outbreak arose from a transport driver driving a foreign crew without a mask, which wasn't designated as compulsory, to hotel quarantine, defies belief. It's even worse that they were clearly advised by Jane Hulton in advice last year that this was a vulnerability that needed to be fixed. And the government ignored it. They were too busy saying how well they were going. Well, we're not going well. Scott Morrison said this isn't a race. Well, there are 6 million people in Greater Sydney who know that this was a race, and Scott Morrison's been stuck on the starting block, too busy patting himself on the back before the race is run.
New South Wales Health says that yesterday it incorrectly advised that the Crossroads Hotel in Casula was a venue of concern that had been visited by a confirmed case of COVID-19. Health now says that the correct venue of concern is Crossways Hotel, 482 Liverpool Road, Strathfield South. The dates and times remain the same. Many have called for a rethink on whether schools should be closed during lockdowns. Now, mental health practitioners in Victoria say repeated lockdowns are resulting in more children suffering from a form of anxiety known as school refusal. Mary Guerin checked it out.
Push it up, so you go up like that. There we go. Oh, let's see that. Referrals to my clinic doubled last year. And then I would say have almost tripled, I would say. I mean, I'm getting referrals from mums who are ringing up, pulling their hair out, saying my kid's on strike. They've locked down. In fact, they're locked down in their bedrooms and not coming out.
Asher, what's your favourite part of your sessions with John?
Playing with Max.
Up. High five.
Good boy.
Good boy, Max.
In terms of getting Ash off to school, it had been the worst I'd ever seen Ash by far, and at times it was almost, a physical battle to even get them dressed. There was tears, there was yelling.
largely what we're dealing with is separation anxiety from mum. Separating at the school gate is one of the things that informs school refusal. And so here in the park, what we can do is work with mum and dad and child, and then gradually, as they play, separate them. So it's exposing them to being independent of mum whilst they're playing.
To see the change just in the last few weeks has been amazing.
I like doing maths and writing.
And what were you thinking when you didn't like school?
That I would miss Mum.
And what are you thinking now about school?
That she's going to come back. And if I think about something else, then I won't miss her.
There you go, good girl. See? I'm trying to provide a service which is a bit more engaging for kids, where they feel that yes, they can say yes to meeting a counsellor in an environment where they feel more comfortable and safe.
I also think there needs to be more alternative educational settings for kids who are struggling with school refusal and school anxiety. There just aren't enough alternative settings.
Yeah, high fives.
That is the latest from ABC News. I'm Miriam Cora. Remember, you can also keep up to date at news.abc.net.au and on ABC iView. We'll have more on our top stories next. That will be coming up shortly. Stay with us here on ABC News.